Well, it's another Monday morning. I got a few items of interest here. I got some pretty good feedback on the video from last Monday, and I do appreciate that, by the way. This is just a few items of interest that I noticed today. This one here was one that I noticed that has LED stoplights, and it came with them, I believe. And LED stoplights can go out the same way that regular stoplights can. The difference is LED stoplights and LED lights in your house too will continue to use power even though the light is not shining, because the chips in the light that make it work still consume power even if the light's not working, from what I'm able to understand. And that high mount stoplight in the back, I believe that's probably an LED too. The Explorers years ago though used to have a sort of a funky fluorescent type high mount stoplight on them, and that thing would go out sometimes too, and it required a whole assembly whenever that happened. And I was looking for a way I could it had a little sort of a ballast that it used for that high mount stoplight, and I was looking for some kind of way to measure what was coming out of that ballast going to that light. But whenever I realized it was 40 or 50,000 volts, I was thinking, well, I don't really have a good thing to measure that with, and so I would just replace the whole assembly, and that would always get those going again. So, you know, sometimes you don't need to do a whole lot of testing. If there's power and ground coming to that ballast, then all you got to do is go ahead and just replace the ballast and the light assembly and all that. Now this right here was an old pickup truck I saw years ago that I took a picture of driving down the road. Now I made a sort of a, this is not the watercolor, but I actually converted this to a digital watercolor and called it Alabama Steel. I've got a whole coffee table book full of digital watercolors that I made that's available on Amazon under my name, and it's called Memories of South Alabama, and it's got a lot of cool digital watercolors I made. I got an app that I use to take a photograph and change it to a watercolor, and it's really surprising how much more interesting an uninteresting photograph can become an interesting one if you turn it into a watercolor. And you know, of course, I like doing that with cars and tractors and other stuff too, you know. Now you got to label the components of this EGR system, and this the newer EGR system actually has, well, let me back up here for a second. This old kind of EGR system was from back in the 80s. It just had one hose going to that PFE sensor. And when that PFE sensor was at rest, it was supposed to have about 3 1/4 volts if you were measuring it on the output terminal. Now, whenever the first pewter aluminum, you know, cast aluminum ones came out, that one was supposed to read 0.6 of a volt when it was at rest, and it was supposed to go up from there. You know, and the one on here, these plastic ones typically would read 1 volt when they were at rest. And so what I always like to do whenever I'm working on a system is I like to measure the voltage at each pertinent sensor and see what it's supposed to be. I started doing that back in the mid-80s because whenever I went to Ford's electronic engine control school, they had this ridiculous H manual that was supposed to lead you step by step to find out what was wrong. After about a week of trying to use that thing, I threw that thing back on the shelf and never opened it again. And I just started measuring voltages and patterns on stuff with my tools. And whenever I would get a vehicle in there, I would measure the voltages on everything, and the closed and open switches and the thermistors and the TP sensor and all that. And I got to where I recognized what a good one looked like, and that way I would be able to recognize a bad one. Well, the newer ones, like on the pickup truck that I've got now, and I could have taken a picture of it if I wanted to, all of this, this sensor and this EGR valve and the little motor that operates, it's all built together. It's all in one piece, so that and they do go bad. You have to change them out sometimes. You know, and not long after, like in the early 2000s, they started putting those on there, and they ran for a long time. But what the deal was on that, it was a feedback. Ford was using a feedback for the EGR a long time before it was even required. because there was no OBD2 until 1994, and it didn't become mandatory on everything until 97. And there were some 1-ton vehicles that didn't have OBD2 on them until 98. But the long and the short of it is, you got this supply tube that's feeding the exhaust into the manifold right behind the throttle plate, and so this would measure the pressure in that, and there's supposed to be some back pressure for the EGR system to work right, and the catalytic converter provides a little bit of back pressure, but some of the older EGR valves had a double diaphragm in them. That was a GM and a Ford thing, and if there wasn't enough exhaust back pressure, like if somebody had took the catalyst off, those old EGR valves wouldn't even work. And so anyway, but this EGR vacuum regulator is pictured right here, and it had vacuum going in, and it would send vacuum out the EGR valve and pull it open and all that. Anyway, that's EGR. But one of the things I used to tell my students is, if I ask you to show me the EGR valve, you better not be pointing at the fuel pressure regulator, because I don't know how many people would see the fuel pressure regulator because it has a vacuum hose going to it and try to tell me that was the EGR valve when it's mounted on the dadgum fuel rail. Please. Anyway. Now, we did quite a few of these intake gaskets, particularly on these engines here, these 3.1, 2.8 and all that. And sometimes there was one shop over here, it's a pretty nice shop, and this lady took her Pontiac over there, and it had water and oil. They told her she needed an engine and all that, and all it was an intake gasket. Those intake gaskets were legendary for failing on that. But what I wanted to point out was, on a lot of these engines, the push rods are 2 different lengths. Every other push rod is like a ½ an inch shorter, and so when you're taking those push rods off, it's a good idea anyway. Most of the time, if you're building an engine, you're going to replace the push rods if you're smart. They don't cost but a couple of dollars a piece. They're going to have junk up in them that you don't want getting into your oil gallery. So just throw the push rods away and start over. But you might want to lay them out on a piece of cardboard or poke them through the hole in the cardboard and mark where they came from, because every other one on these engines is short. I say every other one. And the way they're configured, you can't say this one, that one, this one, and that one. You got to make sure that you know that not all the push rods are the same length. That's the point on that one. Oddly enough, though, if you look up push rods for this, they'll show you a row of push rods that are all the same length. I was looking all over the place for that, but we did enough of these to where I had to teach my students to be careful about that, to make sure they remembered where the short push rods went and where the long ones went, because you can make trouble like that. Also, if you're putting the head back on that has cam followers, those little cam followers, if you've got a roller on them, get those cam followers out of there when you're putting the head back on there. Because if you've got the camshaft on the head and those cam followers are in there, there may be some valves that are held open, and if you're not really careful, you'll have a piston up at the top. When you buckle the head down, you'll bend valves. And one of my students did that. I says, take those cam followers out of there. And he said, no, I'll just line the timing marks up and put it on there that way. Well, when he torqued the thing down, and then we got it all put back in and started up, it was misfiring on one of the cylinders because he had bent some valves, because the piston was at the top, cam follower was, had the camshaft lobe holding the valves open when he buckled it down against the piston and torqued it and everything. And so you pull all those cam followers out of there when you're dealing with those camshafts. Even when you're putting them in time, it makes sense to do that. They're not that hard to take out of there most of the time. Anyway, but these, we did quite a bit of work on these. I kind of like this engine, to tell you the truth. There was a guy named Bert that came to my department one time. Great big old black guy, about 300 pounds, and I could tell he was really sharp. And the algebra instructor her daughter had a 2002 Buick. The motor was bad in it, and so she asked me if I could get a used engine, put it in there. So the engine showed up, and I asked Bert, I says, can you put the engine in this car over here? He said, yep. And so he pulled that thing in, and it took him 10 hours, but he got it all done. Now, he didn't do it all in one day because we weren't in class for 10 hours, but if you looked at the time he spent on it, he did it in 10 hours. And when he went to work at the dealership, he was just as fast at the dealership doing big jobs like that as he was when he did them for me. Sadly enough, though, he was killed in a motorcycle crash, and I really hated that. He was working at the Toyota place at the time. One of my favorite guys. All right, this violent puncture was from a rifle that discharged accidentally in the cab of the pickup. And it went through the floorboard, and it blew a big chunk of the rim out. Obviously had a flat tire. That hand that you see up here in the corner is my son Matthew's hand. He was working at that tire store at the time, and he had given me this picture, years ago, and I contacted him when I was putting together this slideshow, and I said, "Do you remember this?" He goes, "Yeah, I remember it." And I said, "Well, do you remember what caused this rim to get this big chunk knocked out of it?" He said, a rifle round. He said it was a rifle discharged by accident and went through the floorboard and, ruined the wheel. So that's not the kind of thing you see every day. I did know of somebody that had a pistol that discharged once and killed their engine controller. So I'll tell you something else that's pretty stupid. When you're watching some of these cop shows, they'll come up here and they'll look at somebody that's laying there dead with a bullet hole in their chest, and they'll say, "Yep, that's a 9mm." Like you can tell the difference between a bullet hole in somebody's chest made by a 9mm, a 380, a 38, a 357. They're all the same size pretty much, or so close you can't tell the difference. But anyway, I can't look at this and tell you if it was a 30-30 or a 30-06 or what it was. But there's another funny story. This guy that I grew up knowing, he's 4 or 5 years younger than me. His dad had an old white Ford pickup truck, and it had a rack in the window for a shotgun, and him and his buddy went hunting over there put a shotgun in the back window. Of course, he had some rounds in that thing, and he put it up in the rack, and I don't know if he didn't have it on safety or whatever, but when he went to take it off of the shotgun / rifle rack, he discharged the shotgun, and it blew a hole in the side of the truck. If somebody had been standing there, it would have took their head off, I guess, but his dad came along here and beat that piece of metal back in, just to sort of keep too much water from getting in there. I had also seen one time, when it comes to destruction that comes from other places, a little LTD that came in, and the lightning had struck the radio antenna, and you could see molecular spray from when that vaporized antenna went all over the glass, and it destroyed the engine controller, but it didn't even hurt the radio. And I'm still trying to figure out how that happened. But I worked on one that happened to. It'll also, this other friend of mine worked on one that had been hit by lightning, and it blew every light bulb in it, all the dash lights and everything. But everything else was okay. Now this one right here, they said my AC only works sometimes. You turn on the air conditioner compressor and it wouldn't come on, or it might, but if you move the connector a little bit, it would click in and start working. You could go to the relay and hook your test light to hot and go to the terminal leaving the relay going to the compressor clutch, and you wouldn't see the test light shining, you know, with the ground coming through the compressor clutch coil unless you tweak to the terminal. And so what you got here is this actually was on a trainer vehicle, and enough guys had been fooling with this that they had spread these terminals and messed them up. Anytime, and General Motors instructor one time that I heard about was talking about how the terminals on a lot of these GM cars, when you disconnect them and reconnect them 4 times, you're going to start having pin fit issues. Now that is lousy. They basically are expecting that thing to go the life of the vehicle with it never having to, you know, be unplugged very much apparently. But I had actually, on some of the GM ones, I kept little boxes of replacement terminals in my toolbox. I'd buy them from Delco, and the little weather pack terminals and all, you know, and I would actually purchase those. And something else I would buy would be the little screws that they use to hold the ignition module on the side of the thick film ignition that Ford had, because sometimes one of those screws would get lost. So I would keep me a little box of those. And some of that stuff doesn't cost that much. You can just buy it, you know. And there were parts the parts department wouldn't keep in stock, and I would basically keep some in stock, and then I would order myself another one. You know, they'd charge mine out, and it'd be a new part, charge mine out to the customer, and then order me a replacement. So I wouldn't have to wait for the parts room. You know, if you go in the parts room and hear them say, we ain't got it, you know, it shuts your job down until you can get the part in. But I got a lot of cars out of the shop that way by stocking some of my own parts. This photo, I did not Photoshop the license plate on this 65 Corvette, and it was all zeros. I took a picture of the Corvette as it was driving. I was in a turn lane sitting there waiting to turn so I could throw my camera up and take a picture of it. But I didn't realize until I took loaded the picture off of my SD card that this thing had a license plate that was all zeros, which I thought that was very peculiar. And it might be that it's a personalized license plate, but it just boggles my mind that there would even be a license plate that was all zeros like that. It looks bogus and fake. I don't know, you know, about that though, one way or another. Now these split terminals, and I was talking about terminals earlier, they used these in the engine controller connector for years. Now there was another terminal that had a little brass sleeve on it that would actually fit in the same connector, but it was tighter and it didn't have this split in it. They used the gold-plated terminals with a little sleeve on them that looked like this, and the little sleeve was right here, and it was a different terminal, but I ran into a situation where there was a Ranger that was puffing black smoke and everything because the oxygen sensor, you know, was being, that particular one didn't have one oxygen sensor, but the oxygen sensor had this kind of terminal instead of the ones with the brass sleeve in them. Furthermore, there were times when I would find out that there was a crazy issue going on that seemed to be coming from everywhere. You know, you couldn't really, when you're looking at a bunch of readings that just don't make any sense. I would actually disconnect the engine controller, and I would pop the little red wedge out of there, and I would look down in there at those little terminals that had this split in them, and I did this on the older 60 pins and on the 104 pins, and I would pinch these little terminals together, just go in there with a little pick tool, pinch them together so that when I plugged them back into the engine controller, they would plug in really nice and snug. And that would fix an amazing number of cars by just tightening those terminals up where when you plugged them in, the pin fit was good. But you can see how these things would spread out a little bit and get to where they wouldn't make good contact. And I had also told told the students not to shove a, you know, a tapered test light down in any terminal because you'll spread the thing out to where it won't make contact anymore. Fuse panels, would get screwed up by people that would put those little fuse taps on there, shove them in there, spread them out, take the fuse tap off and put it in there. The fuse is not making contact with the terminals. How many times I've seen that? But one way or another, these understanding these. Furthermore, and I talked about this before, where the little crimp is down here, you know, a lot of times if you're having an issue with some kind of a signal at a mass airflow sensor or TP sensor or something, you can actually hold your terminal up like I got it right here and go ahead and solder it, but make sure the terminal is up so the solder doesn't run down in here and fill this up. And you'd be amazed at what that'll do. Even if it looks pretty and clean and the crimp looks good, if you'll solder it, you'll basically take care of some issues that you have, you know, voltage deflections and drop and stuff like that. Now this right here is how I used to take an old CRT scope that I had in the classroom, and I would demonstrate the AC versus DC current on the scope. You could go to Radio Shack in those days, when there was a Radio Shack, and buy a little rectifier that would take alternating current and convert it to direct current. And so I had a little transformer that I also bought from Radio Shack that you could plug into the wall, and it would put out, it had two outputs, one was 6 volt, one was 12 volt. And I'd have this 12 volt one going out, and I would see this, you know, of course this is a time-lapse thing, that's why it looks like it's got more traces than it actually does, but you'd only see one on the screen when you were watching it. But above and below zero, it switching the polarity back and forth really fast, and I'd have to zoom in on it so I could show that. And I'd say, okay, this right here is alternating current on this side. And you might notice whenever I would put the run it through the rectifier bridge and measure it, these little upside down would turn right side up, so it was all above zero. It would be direct current, and I'd have a little motor, a little DC motor there, and I would connect the wires to the DC motor, and it would just jiggle back and forth when I was using this particular one right here. I mean, when I had that signal going into it. But whenever I had this one going into the DC motor, it would spin really fast. However, if you don't want a ripple here, and I need to demonstrate this, you can get a fairly large capacitor and you can hook it up. You know, capacitors are polarity sensitive, negative and positive. Hook that up in between the two terminals coming out of the transformer, and they will flatten this thing out so that it doesn't have all these bumps, and you'll have a nice clean DC current, which is pretty cool, I always thought. Anyway, let me erase these red lines. It drives me nuts. Maybe I'm OCD or something, you know, whatever I'm going to say. All right, those are erased. Now let's move on to our next slide. This is easy to miss but causes big problems. People will come in and they say, I've got water in my floorboard. So this one here came in, there was water in the floorboard. Somebody'd been working under there and they didn't put this grommet back in place, and whenever we ran water in there, you could get under there and see where it was coming in, and it was coming in here. This was easy to fix. We popped the grommet back in place. If the carpet is wet enough, we would take all the seats out, we would take the carpet out, we would hang it over the fence outside on some sunny days and let it hang there until it got completely dry, and obviously we would dry that. Now I've also taken, when somebody left the windows down on a Hyundai Sonata that I had that was a trainer vehicle, I'd open all the doors to the car, and I would put a couple of fans blowing through the car and leave them blowing through there all weekend long, and that would typically dry that out. But the long and the short of it is, this particular one here was on my dad's Grand Marquis. One of my students, who now works at a Ford dealer and does really good work, he put the hood release cable on my dad's Grand Marquis, and the very next day it rained, and my dad called me and he said, I got water all in my floorboard, and that has never happened before. So he brought it back over there, and when I looked under the dash, this is what I found. And so the guy that made this mistake never made the mistake again. And like I say, he was a good mechanic, and he still is, and he's doing good work, making good money over there at the Ford dealer where he worked. But or actually he works down in Florida. He didn't work there, but he's in touch with me. But the long and the short of it is, always put those grommets back in there, because if you don't, you're going to have water problems, you know, getting in the floor. And the water, depending on how the floorboard is fixed, if enough water goes in there, it can pool up behind the back seats. It'll run all the way under the carpet back there, and you'll have a puddle of water in the back. And that's nasty business because you got to figure out where it's coming from. My mother-in-law had an '87 Chrysler. Me and my wife got married in 1992, and this car was only a few years old at the time, and she had taken that Chrysler back to the Chrysler dealership several times because it was a new car when she bought it, and every time it rained there would be water in the floorboard on the driver's side. Finally, she just gave up on taking it over there because they never got it fixed, and she just put a big old thick towel in the floorboard to keep it soaked up. And she asked me about it, and I said, well, let me see what I can do. So I got in the car, and I got a flashlight, and I laid it down there and closed all the doors, and she put a water hose on it from the outside there, and I saw water coming down where a couple of body panels were put together. I had to take the park brake assembly out of the way to pull it out of the way, but I put some of that dum-dum putty on there and took care of that water leak, and I became the hero. Another thing she did was she went back to the Chrysler place because some of her dash lights were out, and they wanted like $50 or $60 to replace those dash lights. And my father-in-law, who was a barber, he asked me if I'd do it, and I said, yeah, I'll do it. And so I just took the cover off of the dash, and you could see the light bulbs that were out by turning the lights on. And you're supposed to technically pull the whole dash out, but I just unplugged the little bulbs, and I had some other bulbs I had, and I put them in there, fixed that thing, put it all back together. And my father-in-law watched me do the whole job. He says, well, you finished that in 11 minutes. He said that would have been an easy $54. Of course, people get paid for what they know and how fast they can do it when you work in the automotive field, so I wasn't charging him anything because he's my father-in-law.
Move it. That's wore out.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
I talked about this a little bit on the last video. If that ball joint is just loose, that one's not in a lot of danger of coming apart. But if it does come apart when you're going down there, and I have seen this happen, I haven't been driving the car when it happened, but I've seen it happen. The ball joint, not a ball joint, I'm sorry, tie rod end just comes apart, and that wheel suddenly becomes a shopping cart wheel just whipping back and forth. And I was behind this 77 or 78 model Dodge truck. And these two friends of mine were on the way home from work. I was behind them in my F-100, and I'm driving along, and all of a sudden, that truck started, rocking back and forth like they do, and it went into the left lane, it went into the right lane, it went all over the place, and when he finally got it stopped, he was on the shoulder of the road. But if that had happened, and he had no control over it because that tire was just going crazy, and if he'd have gone into that left-hand lane when there was a car or a semi coming, it would have killed both of them guys. But one of my students had a 97 model F-250 with a Power Stroke in it. She drove 60, 70 miles an hour, 20, 25 miles to the college, and she parked out there. And after class, she said, I'm going to move my truck to such and such a different part of the parking lot. I don't know why she was doing that. But when she got in it, as soon as she turned the wheels, her tie rod end came apart on one wheel, and the wheel turned sideways. If that had happened, see, she was on the verge, on the cusp of that, while she was driving all the way from where she lived to the school, at road speeds. And you can imagine that would have been a killer. There was another time that we drove this company truck down to the cafe, me and a bunch of the guys, for our 30-minute lunch break when I was working in Texas. Drove it all the way back. The guy that was using the truck to go and grease the cranes and stuff was pulling in the shop at the end of the day, and the lower ball joint on the left side popped, and the bumper of that truck hit the ground like a ton of bricks. And if that had happened while we were driving it, so you never know, you're right on the very edge of a front end part coming apart. And we don't need to sell parts that people don't need, but if you see one like I saw right here, you doggone sure need to, I guarantee you the one, the ball joint was dicey because it was cracked and you couldn't tell. It didn't have any slack or anything. And when I could look at the cross section after it broke, half of you could tell it had been cracked for a long time, and it finally just gave way the rest of the way. That's not anything we could have detected. It's not anything that's hardly ever going to happen either. Springs break the same way, but it's the exception rather than the rule. I never understood why this happened as often as it did. There would be sometimes whenever I would have there'd be a bunch of students that would be coming through there, and you don't know what it's like unless you've been an instructor, and all of a sudden when you're in the middle of your daily routine teaching students out in the shop, a whole gaggle of 8th graders comes through, you know, that you got to stop and give them a pep talk. But I would actually have some of them. Sometimes I'd set up air hoses and I would have them do a little competition to see who could get the tire off and back on quicker. And we would let them practice a couple of times taking the tire off and putting it back on. And sometimes they would spin those lug nuts off of there. They'd put the tire back on and they would put the lug nuts back on like you see them here. And I was thinking the same person that pulled those lug nuts off is the one that put them back on there. Why did they put them back on there backwards? I don't remember a time in my life when I didn't know. If I knew what a lug nut was, I always knew which way it went back, because I always noticed that that tapered side went in. You know, when I'd watch my dad when I was a little boy, I picked up on that. But a lot of people would put it on there that way. It's the same way with these battery cable nuts. They'll put those things on there backwards instead of putting that little shoulder against the terminal so that you can tighten it easy. They'll put it on there backwards so that the flats on the nut will dig into the lid if it's a lid terminal. You know, I've never ever really understood why people did that. Now this is a stiff metal line. It's a fuel line on one of them CSFI Chevys, and because that stiff metal line, for whatever reason, can be slightly out of line and hold it so the nut won't start right, some people will try to crank that thing in there with a wrench and just force it. And brake lines are the same way. You know, I had to learn early on myself. If that thing is not going, I take a good look at it, whatever I have to do, mirror, camera, whatever, and if that thing's not straight, I'm going to take my wrench and I'm going to stick a screwdriver through the open end, through the box end part of that wrench, and tweak that line a little so it's straight. It's hard to teach that, but I will tell you we saw a lot of students that would mess that up, and they would screw the threads up. Now look at this. You couldn't just replace this line. Look at that, the way this fuel line is set up, you can't make another one of those. It's going to have to be exactly like that. So you're going to have to buy a line or a repair kit or something, and you're going to have to put that line back on there, because this nut here is ruined. And you know, unless you want to get a thread chaser and go to work on it, and it down there in a hard place to get to. There's all kinds of problems with this, and I used to, and you know, I had to worry on that. Of course, you know, sometimes when you take oxygen sensors out, threads come with them because somebody didn't put Everseas on them when they put them back in. There's all kinds of, you know, stuff going on like that. But this particular one, I don't remember what we did to fix this. I think we actually had to order a whole fuel line for it or something. But that downs the vehicle, and you got to wait a couple of days or 3 weeks for it to get there, depending on where it comes from. And if they're sending it UPS, with all due respect to UPS, you probably won't see it until the next day because some knothead didn't get it on the truck in time or whatever. Now this right here was a water pump gasket, and I would ask, I said, when you get through scraping that water pump gasket, I want to see it. And I'd go over there and look at it. And I would take my finger and I'd just feel of it, and I'd feel this bumpy stuff right here, you know. And I'd say, okay, let me show you something. Then I'd shine the light from the side, and you would see this crummy part of this gasket that they didn't get off of there. So they were about to make a leak, put it together with a new gasket with this bumpy thing on there, and it would leak. And so that was something that was, you know, I always like to feel of it with my fingers. And for good measure, I would take some sandpaper and I would sand the gasket surface. Now, I will tell you that I didn't typically like using any kind of gasket sealer. I like that tacky, greasy stuff that you put on there like aircraft mechanics use that holds the gasket in place while you're putting it on there. You know, thermostat gasket's a little bit aggravating if it's going in there you know, if it's going on there and the gasket is like this instead of being like that, you know, it's liable to fall out, and you can bust the thermostat housing that way if the thermostat falls out of place. So it's a good idea to glue the thermostat onto those if the gasket mounts in the cover rather than in the block. You know, I could go on about that for a while. One guy that I put to work over there, I taught him, I says, if you can get the gasket on there with just using a little grease to keep it in place, it's best. You don't need to use a whole lot of this 3M stuff, because that 3M stuff, if you let it dry, will actually cause a leak, you know, because it's just not a good idea to put too much of that stuff on there. And I'm not totally against the 3M. It has its place, but there's sometimes it just doesn't need to be used at all. And the guy that I put him to work for could not understand why he didn't use gasket sealer on both sides of every gasket. Well, unless you got big trouble with the surfaces you're sealing, you don't need that, you know. Everybody's got their own opinion, though. When the work's not done until the bench is clean. I used to have to really get on my people about this. Look at these messy workbenches. You know, they would do the work. They were doing good work. I'd follow along behind them. They had tightened all the bolts and did everything right. Then you look around and they walked away and left the bench looking like this. Here's a big problem here. You don't want to leave your grease sitting there without a lid on it, because you're going to get dust and dirt and crud in the grease, you know. So it's always a good idea to cover up the grease with the lid that came with it, or with something, and just not leave. There's a tool laying there, you know, and so on and so forth. Just right next to the press, you know. Sometimes this tool here would lay there. But all these boxes and trash and all this kind of stuff. That drink can reminds me one time of my shop foreman was over there when I was working at the Ford place, and he was drinking a cup of coffee, a little styrofoam cup of coffee. We had a machine, you could put 15 cents in it to make, you know, get a cup of coffee. And he was drinking that coffee. When he was looking the other way, I was drinking a Mr. Pibb, and I poured some of my Mr. Pibb in his coffee. And he drank it and walked away. And he came back to work the next day, and he said, "I'll get you, you sucker. You put that Pibb in my coffee yesterday. I was tasting that when I went to bed last night." I mean, he never did get me, but he wanted me to know that he knew I had done that. Now this I thought was interesting. They said this is a transmission code. So when you got a 700 series code, it's a transmission code. Solenoid switch valve in left rear position. Excuse me? Why did they not know that that was low reverse? What they saw was L/R, and they thought left rear, because they apparently had, you know, left rear, right front, right rear on the brain. And so they typed this, and that's in the programming on that scan tool, and it's kind of embarrassing when you pull it up and get right down to it. This is one of the easiest V6 engine swaps we ever did in this 98 Chrysler. And I really, the boys really enjoyed that. And it looks worse than it is. When we got through with it, that guy was a retired state trooper too. He gave everybody in the shop, he owned a seafood restaurant, and he gave everybody in the shop like a $20 gift certificate for his seafood restaurant. A lot of us went over and ate. But that was a fun job. The students got a lot out of it. Didn't take them all that long to put it in there. And I was really glad they had a chance to do that. Identify these modules. Every one of these modules goes on a Ford. Every one of them is a transmission module. And this one here is fairly common nowadays. If you look up transmission module for a Ford, you're going to see a lot of these out there. And that's for a particular transmission they have. That's, you know, the manual transmission that's automatically shifted. I believe that's what that's for. This one right here, you know, came out in the late 90s, early 2000s on some of the Fords, and it went in the same place where the neutral safety switch ordinarily went, but it was the transmission module that basically, you know, plugged into the inside of the transmission. And this one right here is what you call a lead frame, and we actually had to replace some of those. Now there are some year models of these you can just replace the lead frame. There are some year models you have to replace the entire valve body, and I found that out the hard way. The lead frame only costs about $125, but this is an actual computer. There's a computer in here that talks to the scan tool. Now, we had an 09 model that had to have one of these, and we put that lead frame, we ordered the lead frame, and I think they sent us one for a 2012 or something like that, and it looked the same, fit the same, plugged in the same, but the controller wouldn't talk to the scan tool wouldn't talk to it, and it basically, but it would not even pull out of its tracks. So we wound up having to get an entire valve body and put on there. And once we did that, the valve body with the lead frame that was with it, I think 09 you could change in 12 you could change the lead frame by itself, but in 09, you know, and up 09 you could only change the 09 through 11 maybe, or through 11 you couldn't change the lead frame by itself because it wasn't available. It came with the valve body. It's got some speed sensors and stuff like that built onto it, and like I say, it's also got a microprocessor in it. So anyway, they look all different kind of ways, so just be aware of that. See if you can figure out why this one won't start. These Chevys would do this wacky thing where the maintenance guys was, hey, we came to pick up some lawnmower parts over here at Four Seasons, and now this thing won't start. And then 20 minutes later, they'd call back and say, never mind, it started. And that's always going to be an anti-theft thing on a Chevy. Now on a Ford, if the anti-theft goes bad, you're down for the count. But you might notice this right here, vehicle theft detection fuel disable active. See that? When you see that, see, it's disabled. It disables the fuel so that it would not start, right? And there's a lot of other stuff on it. It's a cool little scan tool over there. But I took that picture for that reason. Whenever this was, it wouldn't start, but after a 20, see, General Motors wants you to be able to drive away without being totally stranded. So after 20 minutes, you'd be able to start it. But if you're trying to steal it, you had to wait a long time. Now this is the scan tool that's on my dash. And one of the things I like about it is I can punch up codes, I can get mode 6 data, I can do all kinds of stuff. And the radio is only a couple $100, and there's a lot of radios that you can get that you can download apps to. Now this app right here came on the radio, right? But you can download it. It's available in the store. It's an Android radio. And this ELM 327 is available on Amazon for like $8 to $10. And this ELM 327 was the one I had to use to be compatible with this particular radio. Once I got them paired, it works beautifully. I can actually get mass airflow. See, when I'm giving it some gas right there, it's giving me mass airflow. Volumetric efficiency, it's actually watching that. EGR percentage. I can put anything on there I want, like any scan tool. I can build myself my own little diagnostic screen. Look at catalytic converter temperatures over there too. It's even got that. So I just wanted to give that a plug. And it doesn't cost all. You can actually get this app on your cell phone using this same ELM 327. But it's cool as all get out to me to have it on the dash as part of my radio. And I bought that radio for a couple $100. The radio's also got GPS on it too, and so on and so forth. And it'll connect to the internet if you've got a signal, or you can pair it with your, use your phone for hotspot or whatever to download your apps and all. Well, I want you guys to have a great week, and hey, let's be careful out there. We'll see you next time.